The Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt is Senior Minister of the Fourth Universalist Society in the City of New York, a 174-year-old Unitarian Universalist congregation on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, she is a graduate of Yale University and Drew Theological Seminary. An editor and widely anthologized writer for more than 20 years before answering the call to ordained ministry, the Reverend Ms. McNatt is a former editor of the New York Times Book Review, author of 3 books, including her memoir, Unafraid of the Dark, a former contributing columnist for BeliefNet.com, a contributing editor to UU World, the magazine of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and a prolific blogger on matters ranging from post-election violence in Kenya to presidential politics at http://rebrose.com. You can read some of her blogs. Her years of service to the UUA have included work as a member of the Committee on Urban Concerns and Ministry, the Task Force for Strategic Options for Beacon Press, Chair of the Board of Trustees of Star King School for the Ministry, and membership on the UUA panel on theological education, as well as the UUA Board of Trustees. The Reverend Ms. McNatt also served as faculty member of the 2008 International Council of Unitarian Universalists Leadership Training Conference in Nairobi, Kenya, the first ever such gathering on the African continent. Currently, the Reverend Ms. McNatt serves as the convener of Occupy Faith New York City, a multi-faith economic justice organization founded in the spirit of Occupy Wall Street. She's also an adjunct instructor at Union Theological Seminary, a founder and active member of the Unitarian Universalist Trauma Response Ministry, created to provide culturally sensitive liberal religious responses to mass disaster and other significant trauma, and chair of Disaster Chaplaincy Services of New York, the multi-faith disaster spiritual care service for the metropolitan New York area. She lives in New York City with her husband Robert and their 2 sons, Alan and Daniel. It is with pleasure that we introduce her here today.
We have one more announcement.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me with you. I'm almost awake, and morning is so difficult for me, even no matter what time zone I'm in. And I always laugh with my congregation and try to persuade them that church should begin at 4 p.m., but no one listens to me. So I have to get up at 11 and be there by 11 like everybody else. I want to thank everybody who has been so gracious to me here. I want to thank Elizabeth Malone, who has been a trooper, trying to manage time zones in my insane schedule and sending emails and sending more emails and sending still more emails. But I think we got it together, right? I felt very welcome among you. I had a great dinner with folks. And as I said, a member of my congregations are here, of my congregation, my former member, who's out there somewhere. And people that I knew from my intern years. Jessica's out here someplace. I saw her at breakfast. Who I knew when I was an intern at the Unitarian Church of Montclair, New Jersey. So it kind of feels like I brought a little bit of the States with me. My husband sends greetings. He couldn't be here because we have a 16-year-old applying to college. I want to start with words from my colleague, the Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein, who does a blog called Peace Bang. And she wrote an entry on July 25th, 2011. And this is what she said, part of what she said. I've been screaming and yelling and doing everything but laying down on chancels, throwing temper tantrums for years against liberal religious terminal uniqueness, that bizarrely insistence that lefty Christians and Unitarian Universalists have, that we're the really unique game in town. We're the thinkers. We're the skeptics. We're the ones who stand on the side of love. We're the ones who don't want to be told what to believe. Yes, just like every other mainline Protestant that I have ever met, and I have met thousands. I have spent the past 5 years, she writes, in constant conversation with clergy of all denominations from all over the Western world. And can I tell you something? The progressive spirit is everywhere. Now, I believe, she continues, that it's our insistence that we're unique that keeps us all looking very silly and out of touch to seekers who have done some comparison shopping and can tell us for a fact that our differences are almost entirely cosmetic. The Unitarian Universalist who cannot think metaphorically and who refuses to respect how deeply metaphor ministers to many people's soul in his congregation or her congregation is just as doctrinaire and fundamentalist as the Bible thumper who insists that every word of the Bible is God's truth. Same, I'm telling you. I think the future of the church depends on our ability to move beyond terminal uniqueness. How many of you know where the term terminal uniqueness comes from? Not anybody. Cool. Well, actually, it does not have its origins in the religious movement. It actually has its origins in the recovery movement. It's a form of denial that's pretty familiar to people in 12-step programs. And at the core of it is this kind of self-regard that can be profoundly destructive. The mindset is something like, I'm so different, I'm so special, my problems, my challenges are so bad, no one can help me, no one can understand me, no one can connect to me. Not all of us suffer from terminal uniqueness, but I agree with Victoria and many other people that even though we may not individually suffer from it, our movement does. I think that even though we are a small group in the larger religious world, we have this tension, this ambivalence. On the one hand, we want to grow. We want people to know who we are. On the other hand, we're a little suspicious. If too many people know who we are, then maybe we're not as cool as we think we are. And I have had more than one person tell me that most people aren't really Unitarian Universalist because they're not really smart enough. They aren't intellectually demanding enough. They can't really tolerate reality as we truly can understand it. We tell ourselves, we really do, that only certain kinds of people can be UU. And even if we don't tell ourselves specifically and directly as these people have over the years, there's a little piece of our heads. And we kind of think about it, and it's kind of in the culture of our faith. I think we keep coming up with lots of ideas and strategies and programming to increase our numbers. But I also think we subconsciously subvert the work that we want to do in order that we might preserve that special sense of self that we carry around with us. Some of us just can't face the fact that we are just like other religious people. And the truth is we are. We really are. We're like those people in more ways than we want to admit. It's important to us to be part of a religious community. And being part of a religious community and having a spiritual life means that we share a set of qualities that are remarkably similar along the line of other faith traditions. Now, in addition to our own unique brand of denial, we're also in this huge shift demographically and in terms of our own faith tradition. The pendulum has swung again, just as it began to swing in the 1930s. And it's swung past the predominance of humanism in our movement. As late as 1989, about 79% of our movement members were humanist, considered themselves humanist. And now, There is no single theological position that dominates in our faith for the first time in a very long time, perhaps ever. I believe that this is a healthy swing. And I believe that the pendulum has swung very far into a notion of spirituality that for a whole generation of Unitarian Universalists is unfamiliar and a little frightening. And I say this part of it sort of anecdotally on the basis of the seminaries at which I teach. I'm not teaching at Union this semester. I'm at Yale Divinity School this semester teaching history and polity to Unitarian Universalist seminarians. There are about 8 to 10 UU seminarians in a school that is predominantly Episcopalian, Baptist, other mainline Protestant denominations. Union is where I do a lot of my teaching every other year. In my last class, I have 14 UU seminarians in varying stages of their development. And I talk a lot to the newcomers who come into my congregation. And even in the 12 years that I've been serving, I have seen a shift in the kinds of people who've been coming to church. In short, the holy is making a comeback in ways that people have ambivalent feelings about. And as an aside, I have to say I am going to be fascinated to see what challenge awaits Unitarian Universalist congregations who have roots or big membership in the humanist tradition as they seek religious leadership among ministers whose spiritual practice and grounding is very different from their own. I think that that's going to be a real surprise and for some people a real shock, because an entire generation of ministers is going to retire in the next 10 years. So it's going to be different. No one really knows how it's going to be different, but it's going to be different. As younger people connect to our congregations, some through friendship, some through social justice, some through proximity, as they face a modern life that is less secure, less affluent, more diverse, and more understanding than our generation, they express the desire routinely, in my experience, to connect to something larger than themselves for the sake of something greater than themselves. As a result, there continues to develop within Unitarian Universalism a growing counter-narrative about our faith. It's rooted more intensely in covenant than it has been in a long time. It is open to many more faces and expressions of the holy. It makes demands of its members, and they're demands that people are learning to embrace. And so there is a lot of uncertainty about what we face. There's an old story that's told across many cultures of a couple that had been greatly blessed with the birth of their first son. And when they sat down to decide on the child's name, they couldn't agree on a name. In fact, they were so angry with one another that they sought out the help of their spiritual leader. And together with the child, they stood before this holy woman and asked for her help. "What do you want to name this child?" she asked the father. "I want to name him Kaliba," the father replied. "And what do you want to name him?" she asked the mother. "I want to name him Kaliba," the mother replied. Well, the holy woman was baffled. "Well, if you both want to name him Kaliba, what is the problem?" she asked. "Well, that's what I want to know," the father said. "Kaliba is the name of my wife's uncle, a wise and learned man. It would bring honor upon our son to give him this name." But the mother protested. "I wouldn't mind that, but your uncle's name is also Kaliba, and he's a horse thief and a scoundrel. What mother wants a name like that for her son?" And so the holy woman looked at them both for a minute, and at their young son, and then she smiled. And she said, "Name your child Kaliba. When he is an adult, you will have a chance to see who and what he becomes, and then you'll know which one of you was right." And in some ways, we are like that child, this faith of ours. Unitarian Universalism is like that. I wish I could tell you that this was a conversation that was relatively new to me and kind of different, but I have to tell you that for as long as I have been a Unitarian Universalist, and that was 1985, the year I got married. I married into Unitarian Universalism, by the way. My husband is birthright, so are my children. And I discovered it when I met the man I married. And so in overcompensation, I became a minister instead. The overachiever that I am. I thought I'd have to do something to make up for it. But in all the time that I've been a UU, I've had this conversation kind of whirling around in my head and going on with other people that I knew. And at the early years of that conversation, we were over in corners talking about it because we really weren't, willing to talk about it publicly. When we are at our best, Unitarian Universalism is a beacon of freedom and justice and wholeness. At our best, we create these religious communities of memory and resistance and hope. And they make a crucial difference in the lives of many people. But we're not always at our best. And at our worst, we have become, as I once told someone, a way station for the disenchanted, the disruptive, the dyspeptic. At our worst, we have created social clubs of the self-congratulatory and the self-involved, and it gives liberal religion a bad name. But because we are still becoming, it is still too early to tell what kind of faith we are going to be. I'm not the only one that's been having this conversation for decades. We actually have had this conversation within Unitarian, within Universalism, and within Unitarian Universalism for hundreds of years. If you look back at our history, and lately I've been doing that a lot because I've been teaching a lot of our history, you'll find these streams of thought in which people are completely persuaded that liberal faith is about to die and that there is no future and no hope for us. And there's a counter narrative that runs throughout that talks about our greatest moments being just ahead of us and that we have a great promised land ahead of us. So think about these words. Were written 170, maybe more, 175 years ago almost, as the original proposal for the Constitution of the American Unitarian Association. So at the time, the American Unitarian Association was not congregations. It was individual members of the clergy. Individual ministers made up the AUA. And Henry Ware presented a proposal to the assembled clergy, and the idea was to create, as he put it, a new organization, the chief and ultimate object of which will be the promotion of pure and undefiled religion by disseminating the knowledge of it where adequate means of religious instruction are not now enjoyed. Its operations will extend themselves throughout the whole country and will chiefly consist of the publication and distribution of tracts and the support of missionaries. Missionaries. Yes, that's what I said. Now, that was the first draft, and they got rid of the missionary idea, as you can tell. The tracts notion evolved and became what we now know as Beacon Press. So that part of our mission has been extraordinarily consistent. We have been consistent about wanting to disseminate knowledge about religious faith and religious life from the very moment that we were actually organized as an association. And consider as well the Universalist side of our history, which is dear to me because I serve a historically Universalist church, which next week will be 175 years old. So we're having a big party. C. Elwood Nash was minister in Brooklyn, New York, and in 1894 he wrote an essay called The Possibilities of Mission Work in the Universalist Church. Our business, he said, is with both high and low. A primary test of our disposition and capacity to apply the gospel to all sorts and conditions of men will be found in the measure and the results of our efforts to multiply centers of influence, to build for our faith a pulpit, and to establish a fomentation of ideas in every city, town, and hamlet of the land. Such mission work the Universalist Church must do or perish. A temporary stay of judgment, a pittance of toleration while its structures disintegrate, is the utmost fate will grant to a has-been church. A church no longer growing is already moribund. It may command a certain tenderness for the sake of what it was or tried to be. But its room is needed for active enterprises, and it will have to go. That was in 1894. So when I talk about symptoms of terminal uniqueness, I also want to lift up the idea that the past is prologue. We have struggled with this question in every generation. In every generation that we have had, in one way or another. And part of the reason I believe that we struggle around it is because we have a smaller and narrower vision of our origins, where we come from, who we are, what we were born out of, the kind of struggle we were born out of. I think in this generation, our biggest difficulty is our inability to face the reality that we are a people, a religious people, with our roots in the dissenting tradition of Christianity. And that's hard for people to hear. I can remember having a fight with a member of my congregation in my early years, explaining this to him and him yelling at me that we couldn't possibly be Christian. But we are. That's not all we are, but we are. And we're not just part of the Christian tradition as people talk about it out there in the world. And for those of us who've been in the States, it's become quite an ugly argument. We are part of the dissenting tradition. Not just any part. Always the part that said, wait a minute. Always the part that said, I'm not sure about that. Are you sure about that? Our proto-Unitarian forefather, Michael Servetus, died because he decided to say, wait a minute. You can look in Scripture all day long and you'll never see anything about the Trinity. And Calvin set him on fire. Now, sometimes I think that one of the reasons that we have in this sort of unpleasant dissent in our roots is because of the way Servetus and Calvin talked to each other. If you look back and read some of the back and forth between them, they were the two crankiest people in the religious world at that time. They were pretty cranky and evil, but there is this sense of anger and dismissal and disrespect that has also come with that dissent that I think is difficult for us and that places us in some jeopardy. But it's done more than that. I think misunderstanding our role has allowed for us to abdicate our role. There was a time when no important conversation about religious life could occur without a Unitarian or a Universalist in the room. Not just in matters of faith and practice, but in the early days of religious education, as people began to understand what it meant for human beings to educate themselves religiously. Unitarians and Universalists were very much a part of that opening discussion. In the early days of the formation of the Liberal Religious Education Association, which evolved in different ways and did not become Loretta, that's a different set. But there was a religious education association that included all the religions in practice at that time. And we were central to those conversations. I believe that in our desire to separate ourselves and to rebel against the most horrific tendencies of mainline and evangelical Christianity, that we abdicated our place at the religious table. And that decade-long abdication of our historic dissenting role has created a vacuum, filled, unfortunately in the United States, by deeply conservative religious people who hijacked our language of faith. When I think about this, I think about the scene in It's a Wonderful Life. How many of you watch It's a Wonderful Life every Christmas? Yeah, me too. Makes my family crazy, but I love it. So remember the scene in the cemetery? And George Bailey and Clarence go to the grave, and it's George's brother's grave. And he says, my brother's not dead. My brother's alive. My brother just saved all these people on a transport ship. And Clarence said, no, all those people died because your brother died because you weren't there to save them. And sometimes I think about us that way. All those people who needed a message of inclusion and hope, all those people who had questions about Christianity but weren't ready to throw it away, all those people who needed a rational religious voice that allowed for faith and meaning got left because we left. We left them there. And as a result, they were without protection. There were people who have no capacity for religious community today because we left those conversations. Those conversations, in fact, have become meaner, more embarrassing, more difficult, more intolerant than they might otherwise have been without the mediating influence of liberal religion. Just because Christianity, as it's currently expressed in the United States, is more of a source of shame and embarrassment than inspiration and support, was no reason for us to turn away from it. And we still want to turn away from it. And it's only recently that we've begun to question that. There are excellent reasons for us to have placed a big difference between ourselves and the traditional Christian narrative. Most of us do not believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Some of us do, but most of us don't. Most of us do not believe in substitutionary atonement. We don't believe that someone would allow a child to die in our place. Most of us don't believe that a loving God would send someone to hell for offenses committed in another place. Most of us don't believe in hell. But as free-thinking people, we still need to maneuver and live our lives among people whose belief systems are different than ours, who find strength and hope and courage in those stories. And we still need to be able to make common cause with them. And so long as we treat them with dismissal or contempt, we can't. It's hard to stand up and make that kind of argument because I don't know what it feels like here in Europe. But in the United States, the religious right has gone berserk. They really have. It has become a source of profound concern, of fear about the possibility of a theocratic state. Many of us worry about it. And people who didn't even worry about it maybe a year or two ago worry about it now. But in order to face that, we need better tools than we have. Our fear and our loathing of the Christian story has made us unreliable as a partner in religious dialogue. Our carelessness and even our contempt for symbols of Christian faith have made some of us, not all of us, but some of us, as great an enemy of religious freedom as the fundamentalist Christians who inspire our disdain. How many of you have seen the Darwin fish? You know, the fish with the Darwin? Yeah. Now, everybody who's a UU doesn't have that symbol, but a lot of us do. Some of us do. But shouldn't we question that? Shouldn't we wonder about that? Think about it. At what point in our history did it become part of our religious practice to mock the religious practices of other people? I don't believe that that is what we are meant to do as liberal religious people. Because that's what we do when we display that symbol. The fish is an ancient symbol of the early Christian church, and it means a lot to people in the Christian community. So when we stick Darwin in it, we're basically saying, We're poking at people who, whether we like it or not, we often have to live with. And curiously enough, the fish is also a pre-Christian symbol of the Great Mother. and the feminine life force. So people who use the Darwin fish are actually mocking two religious traditions, not just one. So now, I'm not talking about that for people to feel guilty. If you got a Darwin fish on your car, don't run back and start tearing off the bumper of your car. But I do want us all I want to provoke some thought among us about our responsibilities as liberal people of faith. Because this is a time in life when liberal people of faith have an extraordinary responsibility. And a responsibility not over to combat these narrow symbols, but to do it in a way that speaks to who we are at our core. Are we the people who mock people, or are we the people who build bridges? I'm thinking about a member of my own congregation a few years ago, and he came up to me at coffee hour. His name was, we'll call him Leonard. In the time that I've been a member of the society, I always knew him as one of those pillars. You know the kind. They say yes to everything that they are asked. They work faithfully. They're not always running around asking for praise and strokes, though you give them as many strokes as you can manage because they really matter in the life of the congregation. But he was just a good man. And every time I tried to talk to him about something that was larger than the work he was doing, he wasn't rude, he wasn't mean, but he just wasn't into it. That wasn't what he came to church for. He didn't need that. And you can only minister to people in the way they want you to minister to them. So I just kept doing our work and asking him to do things. He'd say yes, we were doing fine. But one day at coffee hour, he made a point to find me when I was by myself. And he sat across from me, and he's usually a pretty businesslike guy, but not that day. And so I could tell he wanted to talk to me about something and sort of didn't know how to talk to me about it. So I just kind of asked, how you doing, Leonard? And he said, well, I'm doing okay, but I have something I want to talk to you about, and I don't really know how to explain it. I said, well, you don't really have to know how to explain it. Just jump on in. We'll figure it out as we go. So he said, well, I don't know if you know it or not, but I'm really kind of an agnostic. And I said, I kind of thought that. He said, well, in the last few months, I've been experiencing this overwhelming desire to pray. And I don't know what to do. So I thought I'd ask you about it. You have no idea how many times people have asked me that. And there's a part of me that thinks, okay, I'm a minister, we're a church, prayer. Shouldn't be that hard. But something about the way we've conducted ourselves over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years has sent this message that this should be more complicated than it is. That this should be harder and that we should be above this and that we should really be struggling with this. When I did my internship in Montclair, I can remember having quite a difficult conversation with a lesbian couple who felt that they had come to our church so that they could experience some peace and ease in their lives, and that they really didn't want to hear from these praying people. And I said, well, what if this is a place that feels like their religious home? Well, they should go find another home. They meant that. And they weren't even trying to be mean. They weren't trying to be mean. What they were feeling was this sense of siege. And that was about it was more than that. It was about 15, 20 years ago. And that makes sense when you consider the climate around marriage equality in the United States, around gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender questioning rights in the United States. It made sense for them to feel like this is my refuge. And now you want to bring those people here who are telling me that I'm evil and I'm going to hell. And that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to get them to accept the possibility that there were other people in the room who had needs that were different than theirs. And that all of our lives we have to struggle with that. All of our lives. back to Leonard. Leonard said to me, well, what do you think I ought to do? I said, well, I think that you ought to just pray. He said, well, I don't know what to do. And I said, well, why don't you just talk like you're talking to me? That's how I pray. God is not some old guy sitting around with a beard and robes on a throne, waiting on you to come up and petition. Why don't you just talk? And I think you should go ahead and just try it and see. The relief on his face, the relief that he didn't have to stop being a Unitarian Universalist. He could just go pray. He could just go have that conversation that he'd been longing to have. I'd given him permission to do something that rose up from the deepest core of himself. And I worried again. Who are we and what have we become that a member of our congregations would worry that their desire to pray meant they didn't belong with us anymore? I think it's an unintended consequence of our deeply important and deeply valued skepticism, our willingness to question things about faith. It's a precious thing to me. It's that openness that first attracted me to Unitarian Universalism in 1985. It was that openness, that freedom, that actually led me from the agnostic that I was to the theist that I am. We affirm all the time the congregational commitment to a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Do we know, really, what that means? Do we appreciate how wonderful it is, that free and responsible search? It means you can start in one place and find something different on the journey. And the companion to that is our fourth tradition: acceptance of one another and support in our spiritual growth. Encouragement is actually the word. Encouragement for one another. We are meant to support and encourage one another because we are on a journey together. We forgot, I think our movement just forgot that we were always meant to participate in these great conversations on intimacy and ultimacy from the basis of a communally experienced and historically rooted faith. That's what James Luther Adams calls it. And James Luther Adams is perhaps one of our greatest theologians. If you have not read James Luther Adams, you should. He's a little dense, but he's worth it. He's worth it. We forgot that we were meant to unite ultimate religious meaning and deeply personal experience. And we forgot that we were meant to do these things not in an insular way, not in a way that's just about us, but in a way that allows us to feel good about Unitarian Universalism and to allow other people to be open to Unitarian Universalism. I will never forget a woman that I met when I was in training at the hospital in North Carolina where I did my clinical pastoral education. Most of you know that when you become a UU minister, one of the things you have to do is study 400 clinical hours in a hospital setting or an equivalent setting. Most of us go to a hospital. And I did it in North Carolina because I had babies and my in-laws had to watch them while I was on call. So my husband put us all in the car, and with all my books, we went down to his mom's house. He unloaded everybody. He unloaded the kids. We put the kids to bed. We went to bed. We got up in the morning. He flew back to New York to work. And that following week, I started my 10-week stint. And there were 14 of us in this class of CPE students. I was the only Unitarian Universalist. Everybody else was a Southern Baptist or an Alliance Baptist. There are 53 kinds of Baptists, by the way. I bet you didn't know that, and I didn't either. But there are. There are 53 different kinds of Baptists so far. And there were a couple Episcopalians, a couple of Lutherans, a couple of Methodists. But the vast majority of people I was working with were Southern Baptists. And there are two things I remember. One, I've never been treated so well, with so much graciousness, with so much genuine curiosity about our faith tradition, what we believe and what we didn't believe, how we lived out that tradition in daily life. I've never been treated with so much respect about how it is that we are free to come to our own conclusions, and how envied we were among the ministers that I spoke to. People who knew that they felt differently than their creed prescribed, but had to face people who would not allow them to move forward in their call if they did not admit to certain kinds of doctrine. They envy us because we get to speak our truth and are not penalized for it in the way that they are. I was surprised. I thought I was going to be in trouble down there. I never had so much fun. They were wonderful to me. But the second thing I remember is one of the women who was an Alliance Baptist. And I marveled at the way she could work the ward and the way she talked to people and the deep compassion that she brought in everything that she did. And so one day I asked her, I said, it's hard, because by then I finally stopped crying. I was in about week 4, and I cried every single day for 3 weeks. I was not at all sure I was going to get through CPD. I just didn't know how I was going to manage it. It was overwhelming to me. But by then I had sort of figured it out and calmed down, and that's a whole other story. But I said, how can you do that? Even when people are rude, even when people are mean, what are you doing? And she said to me, I am the only Bible most people I meet will ever read. And so when they think of me, I want them to see in me the love of Jesus. I have never forgotten that. I am the only Bible most people I meet will ever read. She wanted to be a living example, a living embodiment of her faith. She wanted people to meet her and know her and understand why and how she did what she did. And it's never left me. And the thing that's never left me is, how can I live my life so that people can tell I'm a Unitarian Universalist? How do I conduct myself? How do I approach people, even people I disagree with, in a way that allows people to ask, what kind of religious person is this? I want them to ask that question because I want to be able to say to them, I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and this is how we roll. That's what I want to be able to say. She lifted up something that is a part of our Christian tradition, and I just want to emphasize that that's our tradition too. We may not believe in the divinity of Jesus in the way that she did, but that's our Jesus too. That's one of our great teachers. That's one of our great inspirations. It does not belong, that story does not belong to people who hate people. That story does not belong to people who instill fear. That story is ours too. The story of the Good Samaritan is our story. I think we have a wonderful opportunity to translate for people in contemporary terms, in modern terms, in non-doctrinal terms, the spirit of that story If you remember, it's an interpreter of the law who asks Jesus what we must do to be saved. What do I have to do to be saved? And Jesus asked him to remember what the law required. He says, okay, so what's the law say? The law says to love God with all your heart and your mind and your soul and your strength. And that you love your neighbor the way you love yourself. Do this, Jesus said, and you'll live. But who is my neighbor? The man asked. And you can tell in the story, if you kind of live in the story a little while, that he's really not just asking it to come after Jesus at this point. He's asking for himself. How do I know what to do? How do I face these people, whoever those people are? And Jesus tells the story of the Samaritan, that wounded and broken man. Jesus tells the story. That's our story too. It's our sacred mission as liberal religious people. Who tells that story? The Samaritan is actually the man who leaves. It's not the man who's left on the side of the road. It's the man who takes care of the man who's left on the side of the road. So who is our brother? Who's our sister? Born-again Christians are our brothers and sisters. People like my mother, who's a Pentecostal. People like my brother, who's an evangelical. People in your community who might be drawn to the message of liberal religion and the thought and freedom that we promise, but worry that they can't talk about other things that matter to them. People who tell you that women should be silent in the churches. You've met them. You know them. All these people, whether we like them or we don't like them, they're all our neighbors, and we can't create the radical change that we want in the world unless we can hang out with people that we have trouble with. We don't get to be insular. I wish we did. I wish I could hang out with UUs all the time. I love General Assembly. How many of you have ever been to a General Assembly in the United States? It's worth a trip. It's the third Sunday in June, third week in June usually. Thousands of Unitarian Universalists from all over the world in one place. It'd be great if every day were General Assembly, but it's not. The rest of the time, we're with people who don't even have any particular faith at all and want to know why you do. I had a member of my congregation join the church in New Member Sunday, came back to me to have a conversation and said the following: I need help explaining to my friends why I go to church now. I don't know how to tell them. Imagine in New York on a Sunday morning, most people are not in church. They're on their bike. They're getting the paper. They're on their way to brunch. They're sleeping late. They're doing their laundry. They're recovering from a hangover. They're doing all the things that people do in New York. So for a young woman to say to me, I don't know what to tell them. And I don't know what to do with you, she said. Now that I have a minister, what do I do with you? It was a great question. I actually ended up preaching a sermon about it. Because most people who come to our churches today have no previous religious experience at all. I'm what you call a collapsed Catholic. I used to be Catholic and I just gave up. But most people who are younger than me, at least half of them, they don't have any particular connection to any of it. They don't have any good feelings about it. And more importantly, they don't have any bad feelings about it. And that matters in our communities because so many of our people of a particular generation found us because their hearts were broken by religious community and by faith. And it's going to sound weird, but it's one of the things I love about ministering in Unitarian Universalist life. Because even the people whose hearts are broken by faith and come to us are people who are deeply faithful people. If they weren't, their hearts would not have been broken. You can't hurt somebody who doesn't care. You can only hurt people who found something wonderful and believe that it's been lost. And in some senses, our communities are filled with people who are all along that spectrum of, I don't know anything about this church stuff, to, I used to go and I stopped and now I'm coming because I have kids and I don't know what to tell them, to, I hate these people and they made me go to church and now I sort of come because something's not right, to, I love church and I miss it and I want it back. And then there are people who are like, I don't really care about this spiritual stuff, but I love the community that's here. And that's valid too. What's not valid, in my view, is the idea that we get stuck anywhere along that continuum. Because our growth depends on not being stuck. Our own growth. Not the growth of Unitarian Universalism. Our own growth as liberal religious people is in jeopardy if we get stuck anywhere. I think that the faith that we embrace has never been more important than it is right now. And I think it's never been more at risk than it is right now. Our faith is in danger. Our freedom is in danger. And the only consolation that I get out of it is it's not the first time. It's not the first time in the history of this faith that it's been in jeopardy. I've read you things from different generations already today. But perhaps what I'm most concerned about is the combination of events as they exist in the United States. And I confess that my reflections are colored by my experience and my location. I've noticed that as I have been in Europe this week and sort of watched TV and tried to figure out what was going on back home, that there are sporadic things that come across TV that talk about the fights in government and the fights with conservative people who believe something different politically. But what doesn't seem to get transmitted as well is the sense of religious righteousness that is accompanying all these different changes. And those of you who've been in the States recently probably have a clear sense of it. So those of us who believe not only in our liberal religious tradition, but in some of the other traditions that undergird it, are feeling very pressured. Because not only is our faith at risk, but it's the things that undergird it, that support it. The democratic process is at risk in the United States right now. There are profoundly anti-democratic forces at work in the United States. I wish I weren't saying that. I actually can't imagine that I ever thought I would be saying it. And I always hate those people who talk about, the threats in their lives, to some of the great threats that we've faced throughout history in this world. But there is something so insidious about the very methodical work of people who have decided that certain people don't need to vote, and certain people's votes don't count, and certain people don't really need to be living in our country, that I'm afraid in a way that I have never really been afraid before. And so this story about liberal religious faith means more to me than it used to. And it's always meant a lot. But it's within the context of our religious tradition and all the things that it upholds. Free inquiry, free thought, the democratic process within our congregations and in the larger world. Our fifth principle asks us to consider those things. And remember that all of these things are not creedal. You don't have to believe these things if you don't want to. But we're only as good as the promises we make. And these things have always been part of the promises we've made among ourselves in our congregations. These are things we affirm. These are things that matter to us. And we live our lives as best we can as though they matter. Again, I quote from our forefather, C. Elwood Nash, who was speaking from our Universalist branch again, talking about what we could do, who we could be, if only we would. We stand ready, he said, to give comfort, cheer, guidance to all. Our faith is revelational. It is rational. It is inspirational. It is sunny, though serious. It harmonizes the providences of God and the faculties of humanity. It is democratic. It anticipates and allows for progress. It embodies the genius of this best age the world has had. It welcomes science, evolution, even revolution in its place, while religiously holding fast to the heritage of past uplifts. In a word, it meets the needs of humanity, both for time and for eternity. Could any service be greater than to equip the world with such a faith? So I ask, as we prepare for questions and a break, to imagine falling out of love with terminal uniqueness and falling in love with the idea of embracing our small part of the great work of this world. Imagine us choosing to be workers among workers, not surrendering the great gifts of our faith that we've been given, but simply adding them to the common human store, being fully ourselves in the face of all the challenges that our world brings to us. We do have enormous challenges, but I believe we are capable of meeting them. And I think we should take a break right here for questions and stretching, and we'll come back to it. Thank you. So we have time for questions. I kind of designed this so people, if they had questions or wanted to have little bubbly things happen, we could do that. Or if you're just unconscious and need to stand up, we could do that too. Yes.
Both. Okay. So
Hi.
Hi, I'm Diana, and you used the word holy. So immediately I thought, what is the difference between holy and sacred, or how are they linked?
What's the difference between holy and sacred, and how are they linked? And for me, they are synonymous. I do not make those kinds of separations. I actually am one of those people who loves that song, Everything is Holy Now. And I think that it's intent as well as content that helps make things holy. Okay.
I'm Andrew.
Hi, Andrew.
And I have a question.
Okay.
I think it's fundamental.
Okay.
And that is, what if there's no God?
What if there's no God? And he believes this is a fundamental question. And I think that's a reasonable question. Because we can't know. Nobody knows.
And what if that God isn't Christian?
I'm sure that God is not Christian. That part I'm actually sure of. Okay, so let me see if I can address that. I think, and now we're talking about where Rosemary thinks. And remember, we get to disagree with each other, with Rosemary and whoever else is talking about this. The truth is we can't really know whether there's a God or not. We can't really know the answer to that. We can't. There's no way that I can prove to you that there's a God any more than you can prove to me that there isn't one. We just don't have the information. So a lot of this is choice. How we choose to live our lives, how we choose to be guided, what we choose to regard as important. I choose to believe that the stories of something greater than myself that exist in the Christian tradition, in the Jewish tradition, in the traditions of people all around the world and all across time have some common characteristics that matter to me. And I choose to live my life based on those things. Jesus is important to me because I'm Western. I'm from the United States. I grew up in Christianity. And there are parts about that that really matter. And that help me understand my life and the life of other people. And so I identify with the Christian and Jewish tradition, but I'm not closed to other traditions. There's a part of me that really loves the Buddhist tradition, at least pieces of it, because we also kind of don't understand all the traditions we think we understand. We think we know more than we do. And I can remember going as part of my training to the teachings of the Dalai Lama. Once or every 2 or 3 years, the Dalai Lama comes to New York and kind of takes up residence at the Beacon Theater. And so you can buy tickets to hear him all week long. So when I was still in school, that's what I did. And someone got up and said, what do you recommend for us in the Western world about how we might best practice Buddhist life? And what he said through a translator was, what he recommended was that Westerners stop trying to be Buddhist. And that they spend their time exploring the tradition in which they were born. And that really resonated with me. That really resonated with me. That before we begin leaving our tradition for someone else's tradition, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't, and he wasn't saying don't. He doesn't say don't care, don't understand, don't be interested. He said learn your own tradition first. And I think that's a reasonable thing to ask people to do. So for me, I've devoted my time as a minister to understanding the Jewish and Christian traditions for myself in a way that allows me to help other people frame questions in their lives and situations in their lives in the light of that story or series of stories. There are other UU ministers who don't do anything like that, but that's what I do. And the answer to what if there's no God, for me, is really simple. Because I can't know, I have to just make a decision about how I'm going to live my life. And what I've chosen to do is, I've chosen to live my life in a way that it won't make any difference whether there is or there isn't. If there is a God, if I'm dead wrong and there's some guy sitting on a throne when I go, I feel perfectly okay about saying, look, see this book over here? I did, to the best of my knowledge, what it said I should do. It said I should take care of the poor, and visit the prisoner, and be kind to strangers, and to live my life as a reflection of the love that you said you brought. That's what I tried to do. So if I'm wrong, I think I'm still okay. That's what I do. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Cecilia. I'd like to make a suggestion. I was looking to hear your thoughts. So I'm not American.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not someone who fell off my church. I'm still very proud of being part of the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm based in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing that you're concerned about the future of UU community.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hearing that this is very much coming from the context or environment in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
right, of well-thinking around belief.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd like to make a suggestion, maybe the renewal of UU thoughts, or what is it to be UU,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it would be coming from Europe. Because I get a sense that UU members in Europe are coming from very different ground from UU in the United States. I'm coming here to find a platform for spiritual discussions between different faiths. So I'm looking for people who have faith. So I have a very well-defined faith, but who would accept me to speak to as a Catholic, because I'd like to speak with Muslims or right? So this is just a suggestion. Maybe the renewal of UU is here in Europe based on something else.
Did everybody hear that? Okay, so I'm going to repeat it because I think it's really interesting. Okay, and you just stop me if I'm not right. Tell me your name. Cecile is here and is very interested in the difference between my perspective as a person from the United States who thinks of Unitarian Universalism as influx and possibly in crisis is too strong a word. I don't want to do drama, but we have issues. We got issues. And her belief that this renewal about the Unitarian Universalism that I'm talking about might not come from the United States, but might come from Europe. Because for her, it's important that she be in conversation with people who have faith. That the issue is not one of not having faith versus having it, but having faith and being in conversation with other people of different faiths. Am I right? Okay. So I love that idea. I think that is one of the things that we are called and challenged to do in the United States. I think that some of that is happening. I just didn't make it the focus of what we were talking about in here today. I also believe that the Unitarian Universalist congregations that are springing up in different parts of the world will also contribute to that renewal. And that was my experience in Kenya. I was part of the leadership training group that went to Nairobi to train people throughout the African continent who were starting indigenous congregations. The internet is a wonderful thing. A lot of people read about who we are as a faith tradition through the internet and said, hey, that makes sense to me. So we had people from Uganda, Kenya, Burundi, Togo, Nigeria, which actually Nigeria has the oldest or the second oldest Unitarian Universalist congregation on the continent of Africa. There's been a brotherhood church in Nigeria that was Unitarian Universalist from the turn of the 20th century. So it might actually be older than the one in South Africa. But they also have a very different perspective about Unitarian Universalism. Faith and the debates we have about whether there's a God or there's not a God, they're not having those conversations. That's not a conversation they are having. They're having a conversation about how does faith, as we experience it, work in our world, and how do we use it to make it better for us and for our people. So it resembles, I think, some of the early conversations that Unitarians and Universalists had in our United States. But it's joined with this more modern desire to speak to people who are Muslim and Jewish and who aren't sure what they are but are open to other things, to Buddhists. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. I agree with you about that. It's one of the reasons that partner church movements in the United States have become increasingly popular, where a Unitarian Universalist congregation in the United States will become partners with a church in another country. So we have the traditional ones we've always done with our brothers and sisters in Transylvania, in Romania. We've done those. But it has become broader. We now do them with churches in the Khasi Hills in India, in the Philippines, in Kenya, in Burundi, in Uganda. And those kinds of conversations are beginning. But they aren't big enough yet. So I appreciate that. Yes.
My name's Tom.
Hi, Tom.
In your discussion, you were mentioning that Unitarians have kind of isolated themselves from the Christian communities. And one thing that I noted, maybe I'm wrong, and everybody can tell me I'm wrong, but there's this organization called the United Council of Churches. And I don't know if that's a forum that's a worthwhile forum. I don't know if there's much discussion going on there, but it seems to be a club amongst these organizations of faith. And I'm wondering if Unitarians, if they were a member of that, they might have more input into the overall discussion.
I'm so glad you brought that up. So it allows me to provide a little nuance about this. It was a dual. There's a lot of responsibility going around about why. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Okay. The question was, there is a group called the United Council of Churches. It's actually called the National Council of Churches, which is a sort of umbrella group for Christian faiths, and that the suggestion that Tom made was that we needed to possibly be part of that group to enter into those conversations. And the answer is that there's lots of responsibility to go around, but we have only observer status with the National and World Council of Churches. And the reason we have only observer status is because in order to be a full member of the National Council of Churches or the World Council of Churches, you have to profess creedal belief in Jesus and in the divinity of Jesus. So the Quakers have observer status. We have observer status. I think there's one other faith that has observer status. So we can't vote. We can look. We can't vote. And that has a whole history that goes back to the 30s and 40s, where there was a movement for a hot minute called the Council of Liberal Churches, and how I wish it had actually occurred. But there was a lot of fighting around that particular issue and whether or not people were going to make this creedal statement, if they were going to agree to it, and we wouldn't. So we have observer status, but we also do have some hostility toward us. It's not like it's a one-way street. It's not like we're just mad at them. They're mad at us too, because we don't believe Jesus is our Lord and Savior. We're not prepared to say that. Some of us are prepared to say Jesus might be the inspiration for our lives. But we're not prepared to say that we're sinners and that we're going to hell when we die, because that's not our theology. Yes. Thank you, Tom. That was great for you to bring that up.
Hi, my name is Natalie. I was born into a Unitarian family, and I have a question about the humanism. You said in the late 80s, up to 79% Unitarians declared themselves as humanists. Where did they go? Did they become theists as they got older, or did they leave the church and create something else? Because I've noticed that difference. It's been a question mark for me.
Natalie, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Natalie asked, where did the humanists go that were in UU churches? And it's not that they're gone. There are humanists right in this room. Am I wrong? Right. Okay, so humanists didn't go anywhere. Now, there are humanists who aged out, right? And they've died, and they've done something else. And there are humanists who are coming along, but not at the same numbers. Not at the same numbers. It's the generational shift. It's primarily a generational shift. Not all humanists woke up one morning and said, I want to be baptized. That's not what happened. So I just want to reassure everybody that there hasn't been that much change. But I do think that there is a change in the quality of the humanism that has developed. Just as the original humanist movement in the 1930s really was a response to the horror of the war, of the First World War, and the notion that if there were a real God, God would have stopped this carnage, which is really some of the impetus behind it. Not all of it, but a big impetus around this whole notion of this divine presence that was going to change everything. And remember, too, this is also the time when we're having these profound scientific breakthroughs. So together, those two together say, wait a minute, human agency is going to address the problems that we have in this life. And we need to stop waiting for some old guy on a throne to fix us. Right? So just as that happened in the 30s, in the turn of the century up until the 30s, there was a change in our culture in response to the wars, to another set of wars, to the stubborn insistence of poverty and the other ills that have plagued our culture. And the question is, well, human beings aren't that great. If human beings were so wonderful, how come they haven't fixed all these problems they said they were going to fix? So that's why it's really a pendulum. Science is not the answer to every question. And I think that's also a false dichotomy that people began to understand. That it's not like, okay, it's not religion versus science. Even though I think that there are people on both sides of the aisle that try to set it up that way. It's always been within the Unitarian Universalist belief that religion and science are totally compatible. Because in fact, they're asking different questions. In my mind, science tells us how something happens. And religion talks about why. It's asking different questions, and so I don't expect the same things from them. You're welcome. Yes?
If the gradual shift from humanism back to a more theistic direction is a generational shift, couldn't it also be a cultural shift? By that I mean that in the 1960s and the 1970s, to be humanist was the radical, challenging, creative option, and to be Christian was the safe, comfortable, conservative option. Hasn't that shifted around? Christianity has had so many challenges it's had to cope with, that to be Christian today is the radical, challenging, creative option, and to be humanist is the safe, comfortable, conservative option.
Whoa! Well, I wouldn't go there. But what? Because I think it's too either or.
Rosemary, repeat, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, is it not more, just as there was a generational shift between humanism and Christianity, or humanism and theism, that at the time humanism was the more radical and creative option, and Christianity was the safe, conservative choice. Is it not possible that now, with the problems that we face, that Christianity has become the creative and radical option, and humanism has become the conservative and safe choice? And my answer to that is that I wouldn't say that. But I would say that just as there was a deep disappointment in what people felt Christianity could do, what theism could do, there has been a generational deep disappointment about the limits of human agency. Because there's stuff we can't fix. There's stuff we don't know how to do. And yet. Yeah, but yet's a long time. Yet is a long time. And there's some things that science can't fix yet that they won't be able to fix in human beings. There's things about loss and grief that science can't fix. There's things about our own sense of disappointment in ourselves that science can't fix. For me, the big issue around humanism has always been, how does the humanist frame of mind, as it has been traditionally expressed, deal with things like our own sense of failure, our own need to own our mistakes, our own capacity for confession and forgiveness and reconciliation and renewal. I've never been able to find in the humanist practice something that's helped me with that. But I have been able to find in many spiritual traditions a way of managing those feelings. So, and I don't think I'm alone in that. It doesn't mean that humanism is bad or a failure or terrible, because we need people to think clearly and address deeply and seriously the problems that we have as human beings and the problems that we've created as human beings in the world that we live in. I just happen to be one of those people who believes that we are co-creators with the divine, that there's a job that the holy can do and a job that only we can do. And I don't think it's either one or the other, but I do like the question.
I'll just mention, although I am quite comfortable as being seen on the Christian side of Unitarianism, my wife is actually more humanist than Christian. So just proves the point, it is not one side winning over the other that will move us forward, but working partnership between Christians and humanists.
I'm the aforementioned wife I found for myself, to describe myself, if I want to attach a label to myself, I describe myself as a non-scripture bound Unitarian. I draw from various sources. I'm a theist in that sense that I believe in the existence of something I call God, because it's such a short word for it. but I also am open into various directions. And I think a danger I see, I'm born in 1956, I went to a lefty university, I was a lefty myself, I still probably am a lefty, but the lefties never got anywhere because they split themselves up over so many points of principles. And now, since I'm reached middle age, I would like to be part of a movement which still stresses the unifying factors rather than the dividing ones.
I love that. Thank you. We have a question up front.
I'm Dorsey.
Hi, Dorsey. I'm going to give her mine. Hold on.
Well, just another aspect of a cultural shift. The cultural shift also, another aspect of it, when I was brought up at UU, the minister was a man, all the ministers were men. I never heard that, apparently there were a few women somewhere, but I never heard of it. And now I believe that women are the majority, or 50% of our ministers, and can't, without talking about cause and effect, isn't that somehow significant?
That's a great question, and that has some significance. I think the dividing line was 2000 something. I can't remember. It was in the 2000s that Unitarian Universalist ministers went over to majority women. At this point, it's 56% of Unitarian Universalist ministers are women. I do think that had a lot of influence. I think that the women's movement within Unitarian Universalism, the addition of the seventh source around the interdependent web and earth-centered practice had a lot to do with it. I think that our anti-racism and anti-oppression efforts that began in the 60s and failed and began again and failed and began again in its own process, all those things, I think, contributed to a broader sense of the challenges that we face as human beings and how those challenges change and reflect the different human beings that are talking. So social location really does matter. It's one thing to be a woman in this movement. It's another thing to be a woman who's straight in this movement. We've had all kinds of conversations about marginalization and privilege in this movement, which I'll talk a little bit about in part 2. And I think all those things have contributed to a different understanding of who we are. I think that I'm not sure yet how much of this we're going to be able to attribute to women. But I think that it's more than we currently imagine. I think that it's new enough, that the number of women in our communities are new enough, so that the story has yet to be told. Okay, you and then
My name is Carolyn, and I just wanted to say that about 10 years ago I was in an Anglican church in Durham, and the minister gave an entire sermon on why he thought women should not be allowed to be ministers in the Anglican church. No, it was a very interesting argument. His argument was that religion is inherently female, and that everything about his church was incredibly female, and that everyone in every supporting role in his church was female, and that if the men did not remain as ministers, there would be no role for men in the church any longer. This is not me, I'm repeating what I heard. And that if he was not standing there in the pulpit every day, there would be no way that the women could drag their husbands to church anymore. And so he felt that this was their last remaining foothold. I just put that out there because it reminded me of it.
As a mere man, I'm another representative of UK Unitarianism present here. I'm supposedly now retired after over 30 years in the ministry. I'm not retired at all. I'm in retirement ministry, as I call it. I feel I've been very, very fortunate to be a member of a generation where, as human beings, we've just, and I think we've only just begun to nibble at it. And whether it's due to feminism or what, I don't know. But we've just begun to nibble at becoming self-conscious of our own human self-consciousness. We've begun to be able to explore both scientifically and, if you like, non-scientifically, in a broader sense, how our minds and spirits work. And that, to my mind, begins to knock down the barriers, say, between humanism and a deeper Christian understanding. Because we have to understand and come to terms with and appreciate and develop what it is to be human. Just what it is to be human. And part of that is, as you mentioned, about acknowledging things like the sense of failure, our responses to grief and pain and sadness and loss, some of which may be unresolved, and which influences the way we are as human beings. We can begin to take that all on board, I think, in a rational sort of way, so that it's a false distinction in a way between the humanist and the theist. Whenever I meet a so-called atheist, I want to say, hey, come on, tell me about this God that you don't believe in. God is not something, the divine is not something to be believed in or disbelieved in, but a reality to be experienced or maybe not experienced.
That's a wonderful thought. We have one more question, and this gentleman has had his hand up for a good little bit.
Thank you.
Hold on, he's going to bring you a mic.
Thank you. Is it working? Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
good. I'm Daryl, and I live in Frankfurt. Thank you for the talk. I really like the general message. But so I've only lived in Germany for a year, and it strikes me that the religious landscape that you're worried about in the talk is very different than the one that I live in Germany. And I wonder, I guess my question is not so much to you, but for all of us, which is, the question is, I think, how we as UUs should relate to the religious landscape that we live in Europe. So I sent a son to a German school, and in the German school there's religious instruction. Right? You can either go to the Protestant class, or you can go to the Catholic class, or you can go to ethics, which is what he's chosen. There are two state religions in Germany. And it looks to me as if most Germans don't go to church, but many of them, I don't know if it's a majority or not, but many of them are associated with one church or the other, and they pay taxes to the churches. So I stand to be corrected. But my point is, it just seems to me it's a very different religious landscape, and it doesn't feature so many of the smaller, sort of hysterical, right-wing religious groups. But it also seems to feature a broad sort of culturally Christian community, but not really what I would think of as a believing community, at least not in the American sense. So it just strikes me that the religious landscape is very different, and I don't know what the position of UUs should be in that landscape. I don't really understand the landscape very well, and maybe others understand it better and would like to talk about that. But I think it's very different, and it's something that we need to think about.
I love that question, and it's one of the things that's been great about being here is to have conversations with some of you briefly, and to kind of hear what it's like for you to be UU where you are. And I think that you're quite right, that the landscape is different in Europe, that Europe as a whole is much more secular. And so that than what's going on in the United States right now. At the same time, I think it's important for UUs here to know how life is going back in the mothership, as we call it, because I think that because of the United States' position in the world as a superpower, and the ways in which it throws that power around, for good or not so good, often not so good, the degree to which religion plays a role, and most specifically the ways in which conservative religion plays a role, is very dangerous for all people, and very wounding, I think, for people of liberal religious faith. Dominionists who feel like it's okay if there is no peace between Israel and Palestine, and thinks it's great that there's a war in the Middle East because it will advance the coming of the kingdom of God. These are people you need to know about. And It's scary. So those of us who have to listen to them on a regular basis are not thrilled. And so it's not that we're, well, I shouldn't say that. To be honest, yeah, we feel, there are many of us who feel like we're at war with a different kind of religious landscape. And so think of me as a person who's bringing dispatches from the field. So we got it's 10:30, we got a break for half an hour, and we'll be back at 11.
Thank you.